Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today Great.com talks with Ossi Samad, who is the president of Brothers Foundation. And if you haven't heard of them before, the Brothers Foundation helps to bridge the gap between aid and sustainability by supporting local programs and providing essential resources in the areas of healthcare, infrastructure, disaster response, and education. And if you're new here into this podcast, you definitely want to press subscribe, either on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we're going to look at, what is it that Brothers Foundation is doing, and how can we create this bridge between the gap of aid and sustainability? So I'm very excited to speak with Ossi today. So Ossi, hi and welcome, and thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Beautiful. So how would you describe the Brothers Foundation to someone that is not familiar with your cause or the work that you do?
So broadly speaking, as you described in the mission statement, we work in 4 different areas, which is healthcare, infrastructure, disaster response, and education. So Brothers was actually formed in 1958 by a physician named Dr. Robert Hingson. And how the organization started was that he went to different locations around the world, South America, Africa, actually all over the world, and did inoculations and vaccinations, something that's very pertinent today. Subsequently, the organization evolved in the healthcare area, and we started receiving short-dated pharmaceuticals that generally have less than a year to expiration, and pharmaceutical companies cannot sell them. And then we started getting medical equipment and supplies, and we branched off into the other areas of the HIDE acronym, acronym that I mentioned to you. So that was the evolution of the organization.
Okay, so you're receiving these resources. It might be inoculations, medicines, maybe even stuff like books, right? Or infrastructure items. And then what are you doing with them then? In like, which communities do you work with? How do you implement them?
So first, just to finish the programmatic aspect. So after, in addition to the healthcare, what we started doing was working in various areas in terms of, for example, helping to set up solar backup systems to outlying medical clinics, for instance, or for educational institutions. So between that and the other area that we work in infrastructure, which is related to the WASH program, which is water, sanitation, and hygiene. And, as you might know, water is a huge issue in developing countries in particular. And they say that 50% of the disease are waterborne, essentially, or are related to water. I grew up in a developing country, and we used to have to boil the water before we drank it. You couldn't just drink out of the tap. We're accustomed to, at least in the US, you can turn the tap on, drink whatever you like. You do it in various other countries, and unfortunately, it upsets the stomach and you have various ailments. So, that's an area that we're working in. In terms of disaster response, disaster response actually goes back to the mid-70s, and we've essentially been providing support for all the different areas, when there are earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, and so on. For example, in 2017, and this is more related to the U.S., there were some big hurricanes that hit the island of Puerto Rico, for instance, also one of the coasts of the United States. So we've been supporting a lot of programs in that area in terms of helping rebuild, and again, helping with the clinics, supplying them with medical equipment and supplies, and also with the solar projects. But we've also worked, for example, when there was a tsunami, we worked in Pakistan, Japan, India, various countries, around the world. Sri Lanka is another one, for instance. So, and the last area that you mentioned is education. And the education program started off essentially with providing excess textbooks to various countries. So there would be various publishers that would end up with excess excess textbooks at the end of the year, and we would be fortunate enough to get it from them and send them to different schools around the world. And that's actually evolved more into trying to make a difference in the actual educational program. So we've started providing computers, and we're looking now into providing online reading material also. So those are the areas that we're working in, as you mentioned. And how we do this, I'll start off with the healthcare, if it's good with you, unless you have a question.
Yes, please go.
So healthcare, just broad example, we'll receive, as I mentioned, pharmaceuticals that are generally dated to expiration for less than a year. And we'll also pick up medical equipment and supplies from various hospitals, doctors' offices, and so on. So what we usually do is we'll work with partners that are on the ground in the country. And this aspect is very important from two perspectives. Most important being that we don't want to send things to any location where it's not needed. So our requests are actually coming from people who are on the ground, who understand their communities, they understand the needs in their communities. And ideally, we have something that can fit what they need. So we may, make an offer of medicines and medical supplies and equipment. It could be directly to a hospital in, say, Haiti, for example, or it could be to one of our intermediary partners who has a relationship elsewhere. It could be in Africa, it could be South America, for instance, and even Asia. We've worked in Vietnam, for instance. So usually we'll make an offer and they'll say, okay, we want A, B, but we don't want C, for instance. And we'll make sure whatever we send is exactly tailored to what they need. So that's essentially the medical aspect of it. The one other aspect of what we're doing in the healthcare area, which is actually evolving and I think is very important, is there are physicians that go on various trips, and they'll go to, say, a trip to Honduras, or it could be India, Ghana, wherever it might be, and they'll say go for a week and perform surgeries and so on. So one of the things that we're first of all, we're supporting these trips, but something that we're trying to make sure that we do is there's a continuity of care. We don't want to just support a trip that goes in, does good work for a week and then they're gone, so to speak. So ideally, we're trying to set up a program, not just set up, we actually have a program where we continue to support these trips. So there's continuity of care for patients on the ground. Something that we're working on currently, which I'm actually very excited about, and this is with another partner of ours, is a sustainable clinic on the island of Roatan off the Honduran coast. So the idea of this clinic will be that it'll actually be sustainable. It'll have a revenue stream, and essentially the revenues, and I realize COVID has put a damper on the cruise ship industry, but there are various cruise ships that come there. So the revenue stream will be from the cruise companies, because a lot of their crew, when they need healthcare, they'd have access to it here. This is an eye clinic primarily, optical surgical clinic. So we would get revenue from there, and we'd also get revenue from other, for example, symposiums that would be held at the facility. And we would provide free services to the indigenous people that are actually living on the island. And we intend to put solar panels here. So the whole idea is to make a sustainable clinic where your revenue, so it's not continuously being fed, or it doesn't need to continuously be fed through grants and so on and so forth. So that's where we're evolving. And when we talk about sustainability, that's very important from our perspective to go towards that area.
Mm. So you make sure locals are being involved and they help you run the clinic, and you also make sure it's sustainable by getting income streams locally as well.
Yeah, so the local aspect to us is critical. And I've done a fair amount of reading on development. Again, I grew up, my mother worked with the WHO and so on, she's a physician. locally. But something that we don't want to do is actually damage local economies. So we're very careful as to what it is that we're doing. And this is an evolving philosophy in the sense of, historically, if you look at aid, there's been a lot of aid that's been sent to, various developing countries. And quite often there's not that much to show for it. Yeah. So my personally having come to the US to study originally, then eventually my background's actually in the investment industry. I set up an investment company with a partner, and we used to do trading and so on and so forth. But what I personally came to realize is how much value that can be created in terms of actually setting up your own companies and creating economic wealth. So what we would ideally like to do is give people a leg up, not a handout. So, in the meantime, until you can get to that point where you are in a position to, whether it's to set up your own pharmaceutical companies or it's to set up whatever it might be, that, oftentimes you still have need in between. And that's where bridging the gap comes in, that, we have in our mission statement. We recently went through our vision and mission statement last year, towards the end of last year, and thought this through as to where we want to be and how we want to be positioned as we are working in the development area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, how there's a bridge then between aid and sustainability, that they both are important and that they work together.
Right,
so
exactly.
Something that made me curious is that with so many different cause areas, disaster response, education, infrastructure, healthcare, and with so many countries you're working in, how do you decide where you should place your attention as an organization?
Yeah, the key is really, going back to our relationships in the local community. That is critical, because at the end of the day, what it also allows us to do is maintain a very low cost structure and, understand what the need is that's on the ground. So, we get, frankly, on a daily basis, emails from all over the place. So-and-so needs this, so-and-so needs that. They're all valid. People, there's a lot of need out there, quite frankly. And when you read them, sometimes they're difficult to read and not address. So our goal is to essentially work with whoever we can when we have a good relationship that's set up on the ground. So, and ideally, the more relationships we can set up, the better. So one of the ways we leverage that is to work with some of our partners that may have multiple relationships, and they may even be bigger or much bigger than us, for the sake of argument. So we would work with them. They might be working with 35 countries for the sake of argument. So they would say, okay, we have need in Guatemala, Honduras, and Argentina, and here's what the need is. So we would provide it to them. So that's one of the models. So that allows us to actually reach out further. Something else that we've been doing after, especially at least in the US with hurricanes and so on, is working with food banks. So the food banks, for instance, and again, I'm talking about the US. So we work in the US and abroad. The food banks in the US have a very defined infrastructure. So they have, a group that they all speak to, essentially, which is the parent organization. So when there's fires in California, or what happened in Texas recently, essentially we know exactly, if you're in communication with them, you know exactly what the needs are. So we can then, for example, provide, it could be either funding, or it could be, I've actually personally called one of the corporate partners and said, can you provide us soup? And they said, okay, we'll get, 4 tractor trailer load worth of soup cans. Where do you want it sent? So those kind of things. And that enables us to work. If you think about it, one food bank may have thousands of people that are actually coming to the food bank. So it enables us to broaden our reach substantially.
Beautiful. I see the importance of building those relationships so you know what the true needs are. So looking forward then, what do you hope to grow into, and what kind of impact would you like to have in the next 10 years?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. Again, ideally, um, our vision, and we talked about a mission, but our vision is where a world where aid leads to sustainable development. So what we would love to see is anywhere where we're helping that program, whatever we are involved with, that actually leads to some sort of a sustainable activity as opposed to us forever providing whatever it might be that we're providing. So that's the evolution we'd like to see. Now, naturally, that's a difficult place to be. I mean, I think we'd all in the development area like that to happen, where you provide aid for a certain period and it turns into some sort of a sustainable enterprise. But our goal is to keep working towards that. And our shorter term goal, I would say, is to share this thought process with our partners, because quite often it's easy to create dependency versus actually trying to help somebody get off the ground, because you get accustomed to just getting something, so to speak. I equate this to when you're growing up, you might get, say, at least when we were growing up, it was called pocket money from your parents.
Mm-hmm.
Every week or something, you get some amount of money. But so you start off with that and, you're fine. And then eventually when you get out on your own and you earn your first paycheck, the feeling of accomplishment is completely different, I think. Yeah. Is, all of a sudden you feel like, okay, I can spend this however, like I earned it. So that sort of mentality, I think, is something that's very important. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that when we're talking to our partners, we all start thinking in these terms. It may seem obvious in some ways, especially, in developing countries, but I go back to, even myself growing up in developing country. And fortunately, we were, quote unquote, on the right side of the tracks, so to speak. But you can see how when you receive aid, whether it's from the US or from Europe or wherever, it's easy to get in a cycle of always expecting aid. So, but the question becomes, how do you get out of the cycle? And it's something that we've really been looking at in aggregate. And these are broader term, discussions. So the two aspects to it, one, I think, is a change in mentality that has to come about in a broad term. In the meantime, what we're trying to do, again, is to bridge that gap. So how do you get to that point and how do you live in the meantime? So my other analogy to this is there's a saying about if you give a person a fish, you fed them for a day. If you teach them how to fish, you fed them for life. So, but by the same token, if someone's, I hate to use this term, but if someone's starving today, they're like, just give me something so I can at least live. And then you can teach me anything you want to teach me. But right now I'm going to fall over if you don't give me something. So again, so that's what we want to do, is help in that gap or fill that gap. But in the meantime, let's look towards how we can get to a point where you can be self-sustaining, so to speak. So that I think is critical. That's what we're looking forward to.
Seems like a real smart middle way solution where it's not only sustainability or only aid. You actually involve the good sides of both. So someone listening to this then and feeling excited, what can they do to somehow help out and stay up to date with the work that you do in the Brother Foundation?
No, thank you. First, we have made, especially a 2019 annual report, actually outlines, excuse me, it's on our website, which is www.brothersbrother.org. And it outlines the projects that we did in 19. Our 20 annual report will be coming out this spring. So quite frankly, the best way to get involved naturally is by donations and so on. What that allows us to do is utilize your funding or the funding of any of our donors in the projects that are most in need, so to speak. So that's primarily the most helpful. Secondarily, if people do have projects in different areas, or if you're in a country, say in sub-Saharan Africa, and maybe you have some sort of an organization, we're happy to try to see if we can work with the organization, or we may have dual partners we can work with. So depending on where somebody is. But in terms of providing support for these programs, that can easily be done on a website, and we're very appreciative of that. But we're also appreciative of partners who donate things to us. It could be pharmaceutical partners or any type of partners, quite frankly. So both spectrums would be great.
Beautiful. Also, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great.com today. We very much appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Emil. Thank you so much for having us. We're very appreciative, and we hope that the program continues to grow as you're developing it.
Thank you very much. And for you listening, if you enjoyed this episode, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that is showing the algorithms that this is an important conversation, so more people can learn about the importance of combining aid and sustainability. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. What is Great.com? That is the most common question that we get. And the shortest answer I can give you is that we are a company that is moving money from the online casino industry and donates it to charities that is helping the environment. The long answer, unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you today. But if you're curious, definitely Google what is Great.com to learn more.